welcome to Other Lands Editing Podcast, where two speculative fiction writers and editors help you craft fantastical worlds by keeping an eye on exacting editing and foundational writing principles. Every 2 weeks, we bring you interviews with other writers, advice on editing and writers' craft pitfalls, and reviews of popular media to help you grow. So sit back, relax, and join Margaret Bates and Midnight Boss as we discuss all things writing and editing. Hello. A few notes before our podcast starts for this week. We are talking about point of view, although some of it does eventually get into strategically planning your novel to make sure the character with the right amount at stake is also the focal character for different chapters. So it does sort of evolve from point of view as well. Second announcement is that for St. Patrick's Day sale between now and March 24th, if you book at Other Lands Editing, which is otherlands-editing.com, and you book with Margaret Bates, you can get 30% off on developmental or line editing, and you can also get 25% off on beta reading services. So again, for our St. Patrick's Day sale, at least if you book with Margaret, you can get 30% off developmental or line editing and 25% off any beta reading needs. So that's all I have for those announcements, and enjoy our podcast on point of view. Thank you.
Welcome to the POV cast. Today we're going to be talking about point of view, which to write, pros and cons, all the things that you care about as a writer with point of view. So what do we want to talk about? Where do we want to start in with this?
I think for me, some people don't even know what point of view is or what their options are. Sort of running down the different types is always helpful because I think
Yes.
people do what they feel they've seen in books, but they maybe not even know what the term is for it yet.
So point of view has to do with who your main character is, who is telling the story, basically, and then how they're telling the story. So when we talk about first, second, and third person, we're actually also referring to the pronouns that you use in order to affect that. So first person is who's the first person? It's you. You're the author, and you would use I and me. And then second person is you. And then third person is he, she, they. So the perspective shifts depends on who's doing it.
I'd say that oftentimes the perspective is dictated by the genre. I don't know if it always should be, and that's definitely we're going to get into, but there are some genres that lend themselves more or are more traditionally first person based, and some that are more traditionally third person based. It's very rare unless someone's trying an experimental novel or kind of a gimmick to see second person or books told to you. We'll get to that a little bit, but I feel like first person is something you have for young adult, new adult, some contemporary romances, though not all. And urban fantasies for a while were very heavily first person. Whereas I know that you are more experienced with third person because of some of the genres you read.
Yeah, fantasy proper, not necessarily romantasy. Fantasy is more likely to be in third person, often science fiction in third person. There are reasons for that. So let's talk about some of the positives and negatives that you have of each of these, because it's not really a right point of view universally. It's what's right for the story that you're telling. What would you say are the big draws of writing in first person?
I think, first of all, it feels accessible. Like, I think both as a writer, if you're starting out, especially as a newer writer, and also for the audience, or at least you can think about writing first person as almost writing a diary entry as your character, or you kind of are able to get into the character's head more easily if it's, again, your first time writing or a newer situation with that. But also, I think there can feel like there's especially more of an emotional intimacy in first person, and I do think that's why it became so popular, not just in young adult, but especially in first person for new adult and contemporary romances, where I think they want to have that kind of intimacy because of the intimate scenes, but also showing the emotional growth of the characters while inside their heads. So I think that's one reason is getting to feel that person and know that person who's the lead character well, or thinking you're doing that.
Yeah, so to that emotional intimacy, it's not necessarily, although some TikTok girlies would disagree, that you become the character, but it's more like there's a less of a filter between you, the author, and the character that you're portraying. So it feels easier to access those emotions. It may not actually be what happens, but it does feel like it's easier to get there. And sometimes you can portray a lot more with that.
Think also if you're getting to know someone's thought processes, because you can't really hide your innermost thoughts as a first person character from the reader, which is not supposed to happen. But if you have a villainous character, but they're also the narrator or an anti-hero, at least you can get in their thought processes more and know when they say X or Y, they're dealing with their deep trauma and it's a defense mechanism or whatever justification they have. So there's the chance for it to come out is actually more sympathetic for a more amoral character. Although I have seen that go badly the other way, where I think for Grey, which is the Fifty Shades of Grey book written from Christian's perspective and from what was eventually Midnight Sun, that actually getting deeper into Edward and Christian Grey's head just made them sound more like sociopaths. So it's a double-edged sword.
So you and I have talked about how it's really useful to play with POV in a way that allows you to show the flawed perspective that characters may have of themselves or of the way that they're trying to, because this is maybe their journal or their account of things to someone else, they're trying to portray themselves in a certain way. Like you mentioned Harley Quinn at one point, where in the movie Birds of Prey, like, it's very clearly she's just telling the story however she wants to, and then saying, "Oh, of course I had it all covered," and then she falls out of a trash can or something. And so you have that as the author can toy with of what does this character think about themselves and what does the character want other people to think about them. Goes especially in the Hunger Games because I've been rereading it, and the Katniss has no real sense of how she comes off to other people. She frequently thinks of herself as unable to know what to say, and she never thinks of herself in the way like that she is fully valuable and really understanding why so many people are drawn to her. And that's commented on by the characters. I think that's important of when we get to the cons of having the other characters reflect back on what the reality of the character is.
I think it's also, again, a lot of this is going to come down to me saying throughout the episode what your intentions are and what your skill level is, because I think you can tell a lot in a very engaging story with a character who is what we call an unreliable narrator. Again, like how Harley Quinn in the movie is saying all these things, and she's literally very obvious she's an unreliable narrator because she has hallucinations. She'll say something, but the visual cues are not matching up what she says in her narration. She goes, "Oh wait, let me tell you something that happened 20 minutes ago that you should have known, but I forgot to tell you." And I think if you're able to use that deliberately and understand that you have a character who isn't truthful, or at least isn't truthful to themselves because they're delusional or they are lying to themselves, and that's going to affect the narrative, that's one thing. I think the problem is, again, if you go those double-edged swords, that sometimes you have a character who is obviously got an axe to grind or an agenda or a slant to their narration, but they don't realize it as the first person narrator that they have an agenda. And that can get a little tedious for the reader to be like, yeah, but this feels, if not inauthentic, then that you're not admitting your own flaws as the narrating character.
Yeah, there's a lot of burden on first person where you have to affect characterization and all of that with the voice. I don't think new authors are spending enough time developing the character's voice because it's hard to make something distinct on purpose. It's hard to, if you don't have a lot of practice characterizing speech, then it feels very bland, but then also immature because it's not reflective. And
That's true. And I think one thing to point out is there's differences within first person. There is the first person where it's more immediate and it's told as time is passing. And then there's that first person more, if not omniscient, then sort of delayed in time, where it's someone who's sitting down and reflecting on things that have happened in the past. So it's told as a flashback or told as a epistolary novel where you have people writing letters back to someone else, or an old grandpa in his home saying, "Back when I was a kid," and like tells the story. It does have interesting tidbits to it because you could do like, little did I know this was going to be the worst day of my life. But at the same time, it can kill tension. I think about this as the Stephen King model where he'll have something like The Body, which is a short story that became the movie Stand By Me, which is very much back in the 50s. This was happening and this is my perspective and blah, blah, blah. And it's like the kids didn't know at the time they were going to find the body. And at the end, the first person narrator mentions how they all ended up and some of them died and blah, blah, blah. And so it gives you this gift of hindsight in your narration,
Yeah.
but at the same time, since you know the lead character who has to be alive to narrate it, unless it's a horror story, I guess it could be a ghost. But most of the time, that certain danger situations that the character's reflecting on that he experienced when he was a boy or she went through when she was a girl, they lived. So there is that part of it. Like you have to understand that at least you know that one character survived if the rest of their friends or allies didn't.
I think that goes to a little bit what tense you choose to do this in, because I have seen people try to combine of what I don't know what the is that this is going to happen. And I'm like, you're in present tense, girl. You don't know it now. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to do that. The tense that you choose in first person also impacts what you're able to do and how much you're able to elide as you move back and forth between things.
So for people who might not know the word elision or to elide, it's basically doing cuts. Like if you think about it like jump cuts, if you're telling something in first person present tense, you're going to say, or be tempted to say, I went to the bathroom, I got out my face wash, I scrubbed my face, I washed my face. They go through your daily routine, but a reader doesn't want to sit with that. So then becomes the skill set of, can you go from the person first present tense at school and then go, oh, the next really important event is going to be asterisk, asterisk, asterisk scene change. And now I'm at the school dance, as opposed to being tempted to still tell everything in real time and go through their bus ride home, which is not
Yeah.
relevant. But I see a lot of beginning writers who are doing first person present tense and they want to tell you everything as if you're trapped in the character's head in actual real time. And that can be a huge mistake.
Yeah, we both read manuscripts that involved laboriously explaining how someone walked around a car. And
Yes.
that's not something that I think that the author decided that they wanted to do, but they were in the middle of describing it and they didn't know how to move from, okay, we're going to get in the car to they're in the car, let's move on. Let's move the scene forward. It's a challenge to get used to doing that.
I think it is. And I think it's something that, again, is easier if you at least do first person past tense because you're not as immediately in the everything's unfolding right before me headspace.
Yes,
Um,
definitely.
and I think that when we talk about first person, there's this temptation to do it because it is so common a convention, especially in types of romance. And that's where my background is as an author. But if you're going to take first person, and this is even if unreliable narrator, reliable narrators, off the table, already settled, you're going to lock yourself into that point of view for the rest of the book. Like you're there. So you have to make sure that the story you want to tell, or especially if you're in urban fantasy or paranormal romance or romantasy, which you could talk to a little bit more midnight, but you want to
Yeah.
make sure that you're not locking yourself into a way that you can't explain the world you're in because you're only in the one character's head as well.
Yeah. So when I talk about world building, it's your setting, but it's everything that impacts your character or everything else. And when we get to third person, I'm going to basically like tongue bath it as this is your ability to give us all the world building we want. And that's why fantasy likes it. But when you're in first person, you only have what that character would notice, and you only have what that character knows. So you have limited opportunities to do that world building, and that's a concern. And for romantasy, it becomes a concern because there is an expectation of more substantial world building than in contemporary. You do have contemporary world building, but not to the level of fantasy where you want to see that otherness of the setting.
And I
And
think that
go
extends
ahead.
beyond paranormal romance because you said you've had a lot of people in the last 6 months or so as romantasy has gotten so hot, just want to like control F or replace a few things, but basically retool a werewolf and vampire type story. And I love werewolves, so don't get me wrong. But when it's not actually romantasy, and I think part of that is if you're in a paranormal romance, they are very narrow. Usually, especially if it's a shifter romance, it's very much in the insular pack space. It's very much about the hero and heroine, hero, heroine, circling each other. And so it's very intimate. And that doesn't fit with a romantasy where it's supposed to be building the fantasy side of a broader perspective.
Romantasy does also tend to be broader in scope plot-wise. So you're thinking about the larger world and not just what's happening in this one little pack. That means that you have a couple of ways that you can get world building across, and that can be other people talking to them, things that they observe, or situations that you design where they're able to be in on things. Some romantasy has found ways around it. Like some people will like this and some people will not. But in Fourth Wing, you have the character that was training to be a librarian, and when she's nervous, she just drops plot exposition. So I thought that was entertaining a couple of times. I don't know if it sustains through the second book because I haven't read it or not. But then you also have Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairy, wherein it is in first person because it's made it out as her research journal. So she's recording things after the fact, but then she also puts in these footnotes that help with world building because she just like references a study and talks about it. But then it's all in her voice because she does that academic thing where she tells what other scholars have done in those footnotes and then shades them of this is not a good theory, this is my theory. So you can do a lot of things with it, but you got to get a little creative. And I think a lot of people who are writing in first person for their regular stuff are not looking in a position where they can just put in some footnotes and say, okay, here's the world building.
I think that's true too. If you're locked into first person, and you said there's in a way that you could have people like be talked to or overhear things. And I think that is important because you can get maybe one I'll overhear it
Yeah.
situation per book before you destroy suspension of disbelief. I have read because I've done a lot of like Romantic became hot, so that became a lot of what I've edited in the last 18 months. And I've read more than one where the heroine or usually the heroine to be honest had to overhear something at the right time because she was in the kitchen or she was under the stairs. And I had one book where it did it about 3 times within the first 100 pages, and it wasn't, I'm going to buy that there are fairies in a different enchanted world, but I'm not going to buy she just keeps overhearing everything just at the right time either. Like you have to choose your battles with that. And if you lock yourself into one perspective where people just happen to overhear everything, it makes it for hard to believe it set of coincidences, and it makes for reaction, like a reactive character who's just overhearing things without earning that knowledge.
Yeah, it does make them more passive. I will give Fourth Wing credit because, or demerits, I'm not sure, because she's not trying to overhear, but there are two circumstances in which she's overhearing some things and she gets caught both times. So it's kind of funny is that it gets like played out because obviously like her romantic love interest is the Shadowmancer and the shadows are telling on her. But that goes directly to if we want to shift into talking about third person, like the benefit of having third person specifically in certain ways is that you have these other opportunities. And you talk about being locked in for a certain perspective with romance, romantasy. It's unlikely to have more than two first person characters, and you would have to decide what you're going to do with that. But with fantasy, with third person, you can have like 6 to 8 without totally destroying people's understanding of what's going on if Six of Crows is any indication, and it did extremely well.
I think
Normally,
you'd
you're gonna
say
have more like
that
3, but yeah.
in some other genres. Like I think like horror or like urban fantasy, but thriller. Like if you want to play like that and say, I have two or three main point of views, but I also have occasional side one-off characters or people who get caught up in the first spate of, oh no, a poison's been unleashed in New York City. And this person who had one random point of view chapter as like a third person waitress getting home from the diner who died by the poison. So you see how serious it is already. Like you can see things even in other genres like horror or like urban fantasy, or if you choose that third person of here's someone who had a chapter to show off who they were to give a greater scope of what's happening around the city or around the setting or why they've got to solve this problem because it's starting to affect innocent people. So I think that's also something that third person gives you in different types of spec fic for sure and speculative fiction.
Yeah, it gives you room to be able to have multiple characters and they all know different things, so you can create a web of what the reader knows but not those characters know everything the reader knows. So that gives you the opportunity to bring in different parts of the world at a time. It allows you to describe things as you go. That's one thing people like about romantasy is that it's very focused on let's just toss them into the world and they'll figure it out as they go, because romantasy readers aren't as big on just sitting through the world building that you might get if you were doing Tolkien. But also, as you mentioned, your friend who likes to throw in a villain chapter here and there.
Yeah, I have a friend, Donna Ibanez, and she's written a couple of fantasy series. She does one now that's more less urban fantasy and more that's literally just K-pop. So she's gotten some contemporary stuff too. But my way of saying is what I loved about her urban fantasies when she does them is she'll have most of the stuff devoted in third person to the hero and the heroine. She writes het fic, heterosexual fic, but she'll make sure she really develops the villain. So you'll see them not just as a side chapter here or there. I'd say like a good 25% of her chapters have villain machinations or like interactions because she'll have like that old school anime style because she's a big anime fan, or like even, bless me, Power Rangers, where you'll have kind of the villains and there's more than one, their own little cabal, and they're all jockeying for power and they're all trying to get intrigue over on each other. So they become almost as interesting in that way as the heroes because you see them interacting and you see that they are all kind of knives out for each other. And that kind of intrigue adds to that book and that menace of not only are the hero and the heroine against this villain, but there are other even more menacing people waiting in the rings as villain A screws up and gets demoted. So it's a really interesting way she does it, and I love how she does it.
Yeah, so as the like benefits, it gives you the ability to add in world building, but it also allows you to drop those clues for later surprises so that they don't come out of nowhere. You don't have to make it so that it's really obvious, but the reader wants to feel like that they could have figured it out and that they go back and read it and they're like, oh, that
Yeah.
guy was in on it all along. I hate him now.
Spoilers? It's been out for a while now, but for the first season of Squid Game, which I just watched recently because Midnight finally got me to do it, and I loved it, and I cried a lot both. But I'm so sad because I'm like, oh, the old man died, and he was so great. And then fast forward to the final episode, and you realize he's like the rich billionaire who set this entire thing up, and just after he got a terminal diagnosis, decided he'd play once, so he had nothing at stake the entire time. And you're like, no. And then if you go back as the series, as Midnight told me, like you'll see little hints that he was never, and even like the big one I should have realized is that we always see more of like, the body afterwards, or them taking them down to be treated after they're a corpse, put away, and you never see the old man actually die. You just hear a shot and a cutaway. And I should have known that that was different. But it's fun when you have those small breadcrumbs that aren't super obvious anvils, but then afterwards you can go, oh, and then you have a different experience rereading it and going through it at that time.
Yeah,
Um,
it's not really a plot twist if you didn't set anything up. If you're telling the story and then something happens, then it's, I don't know, just random shit happening. But if you're laying clues and like setting up the surprise, like it gives you the ability to draw attention and then like increase conflict between the protagonist and antagonist. Like it gives you a lot of leeway to do many things.
Another example, which is not quite as big because it's not like a murder plot kinda involved with it, is Agatha All Along. Because again, spoilers, take your breath, whatever. But you realize at the end, I always suspected there wasn't. The basic deal is she collects a coven to go down the Riches Road, and it's kind of very much a Wizard of Oz idea where you go down this road and eventually, if you get to the end, you'll get your heart's desire. But I always suspected she had bullshitted about being on the road ever and she never actually completed it. People just assumed she had and she ran with it. Oh no, she created the road as a con because her ability is to obtain magic by draining it from other witches till they die. So she made up the song as essentially a way to trick people to thinking they were going on the witch's road when it doesn't open because it was never supposed to create a new world. She'll get the coven to fight each other, then get mad at her, blast her with magic, and she'll have yum yum good meal of magic. But if you go back and watch it now that you know what the song actually is, and you watch especially the first episode they try and open the road, you go, oh, she must have been so freaking surprised. And then third episode where she's trying to explain the rules, you're like, no wonder it sounds like she's full of crud. She never expected to have to do the job because it never has happened in 300 years. And that's really,
They're
you can
like,
make
don't we need this
relayering
kind of
it.
witch? And she's like, not really.
Yeah, because it never happened. So
Because this
it's really
isn't real.
funny. Yeah, it's really funny. But like if you're able to do that by being subtle on the first read through enough that it makes sense, don't M. Night Shyamalan ending out of nowhere. And then people get that reward of going back and saying, "Oh, I could have seen it there if I'd really thought about it." It's a sleight of hand trick, but it's much harder to do that. I don't even know if you can do it in first person, but it's something you can do in third if you're very careful and smart about how much you tip your hand. I think that's
You can
really
if the
interesting.
first person character is not particularly observant, but it can also make them look stupid if it's a little too obvious. Um,
Yeah, I think there's that skills issue again. Like in first person, it is easier to make someone look quote too stupid to live, where they're just not putting pieces together because you, as the author, isn't ready for the character to make that connection, but the audience has already figured it out. It is harder to accidentally do that with your characters in third person as well.
yeah. One more thing about third person, and we've talked about it in general, is there are different types of third person, and the type we've been talking about mostly right now appeals to third person limited, which would be specifically the third person from the view of one character at a time. We go back to talking about Six of Crows, then you have a chapter that's specifically from Kaz's point of view, and we know what Kaz Brecker is up to and what he's thinking about. But then you have a chapter from Wylan and his adorable little baby gay perspective, and it's very distinct and different. Because it's close third, because it's limited, you, I think, can still get the same level of intimacy that people think that you can only get from first person. And the capacity there specifically for creating unique character voice between different third person limited perspectives is vast. If you can get to the point where you can make it really clear which perspective you're from, like generally speaking, you're just going to put the character's name at the beginning of the chapter anyway, but you have the ability to make each one of the characters sound somewhat distinct. The opposite of that is the omniscient third person, which is out of favor now because of the way that we read. But if you think of like the sweeping fantasy of 80s or earlier, maybe even the early 90s, the omniscient narrator is the one who knows everything, that they have the bird's eye view of everything that's going on. And it's with those kind of descriptive godlike narrators where they can explain everything that's happening as it's happening, and they knew things that happened at the beginning of time because they know everything.
I was thinking
Um,
about it as the once upon a time voice. If you're sitting down for an old story or folk tale, the once upon a time, this is what happened in our magical story. Although the one thing with third person is back in the earlier days, like 50s, 60s, 70s, they were more willing to head hop and confuse people in that way, or more willing to have an omniscient where you might have talking about this character in the next paragraph, you talk about the other character, which we don't do anymore. If you go back and look at like pulp novels and some older novels, they will have, but it's just not something that's been in convention in the last 40 or 50 years. So to be aware of like,
yeah.
this is what was and this is what's informed how we write now, especially for popular fiction, but it's not really something you're going to do now or have readers be as comfortable with now.
People don't have the same kind of attention span for even, say, like The Hobbit, to sit there and tell us the history of the Shire for a few minutes, or then to wander off in part of Lord of the Rings and talk about what happened to some donkey that wandered off. And so it it exists. And I think because we're so into the close third person, it's actually more difficult to do that because if you're that deep in one character's head and then you jump to someone else, it is going to be confusing. But if you're surface level with everybody, then it's not that strange to tell us what the dog was thinking and then move on.
So what are I know and you warned people when we got to this stage that you would lavish attention on the benefits of third person, but what are some of its drawbacks?
I think early on in using third person, you may have some world building fails where you can't get out of info dumping, like you get into it and you start talking about something, and it's not as an easy shift between like telling the history of something and that current action. To go back to the Hunger Games, I'm reading one of the newer books, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. It's technically from Snow's perspective, but the jump between him being at a buffet to thinking about starving during the war is weird. It gets a little boring. And that move into descriptive backstory back into the current moment isn't as fluid necessarily as it could be in first person. You also have the issue outside of world building of maybe going into what you call plot cul-de-sacs, if you could explain that to us.
I plot cul-de-sacs are like a side quest or these things where the characters will get into a subplot and they complete that particular task or they need to do something. But then once they've done it, it has no bearing on the rest of the book and its actual action. Going back to a pretty mainstream example from a couple decades ago, but the Mortal Instruments, The City of Bone, the first book in that series by Cassandra Clare, they have like 50 pages are devoted to rescuing Simon after he's abducted from Magnus's party to a vampire hotel. And in the course of that particular book, once they rescue him from the vampire hotel, it doesn't have any bearing on the rest of the book where Clary's trying to help her mom and stop Valentine. Yes, later in the series, once it was assured a series deal, it comes back that he was bitten and he eventually becomes a vampire. But in the course of that book, it's like 50 pages that are just taken out to do the vampire hotel plot, and then nothing of that actually contributes to the main job to try and save Clary's mom. It's like, well, that happened kind of experience.
Yeah, so because in third person you could tell a wider, broader story, you may feel the urge to tell that wider, broader, sprawling story, but at some point you're going to have to reel in for structure. That is the trade-off that you have to make, and recognize that whatever structure you choose, there is going to be a trade-off in how the story is told and what how people are going to perceive it.
And I think some of the ton of world building can also be an advantage. I have an author friend, and they were really good about repurposing Sleepy Hollow, like the TV show, more than the Washington Irving story, because the original TV show really did the female lead dirty and killed her off in the third season. It's this very frustrating trend where she's a black woman detective in any other cop show, which essentially the Sleepy Hollow is like a paranormal cop show, was, they would have ended up with Ichabod and the lead detective he's working with, and that didn't happen. Abby Mills got really screwed in that. But so then when they wrote this, their reversion of Sleepy Hollow, I think it's called Splint. I have to relook it up.
Yeah,
I'll put it in
it's
the notes.
Splinter.
Yeah. And they really use that advantage because you're not just looking at the heroine and the hero in third person, but you're also getting these flashbacks to the heroine's ancestor and the ancestors non-binary, and sort of how everything with the horseman got started and how that line of power goes through her ancestor to the heroine. And that really deepened that lore. But if you had written it as a first person, where you're only going between the hero and heroine, or even if you'd chosen third person, but not to add those extra options of world building through the third perspective of the ancestor, it wouldn't have been as rich. And I think that is always something you can consider as well. Again, where you have that balance of world building, where how much is too much exposition, but also how much is giving you a glimpse through a third or fourth option you just wouldn't have had if you're doing a more traditional new adult, young adult romance, contemporary romance, where it's only the two love interests, first person perspectives back and forth.
I think Jasper Hyde is a good example of that because they will write but both contemporary as well as some supernatural inclined novels. But while we've noted that romance does lend towards the first person, the ones that I've read from this author are in third person and therefore are able to, they're in third person close, but they're able to build the contemporary world as well. This is created. I'm thinking of like More to Love is the one that I read from their contemporary stuff. I haven't read the other ones. It's not hard and fast. Basically, these roles where they say it's limited. I think that is a limitation of third person, that some people will have this perspective that they're never going to read third person because they only read first person. But you also have the other side where someone may be biased against first person like me because they've read so many where the voice was just not good, and so you just don't want to deal with it. But
And I think
it
that's the other side of it, because we had mentioned limitations of first, but also structurally, if you've read bad first person a lot, I know why it turns you off, because a lot of times it can become like very sing-songy, or like reading a very set list of I did this and I did that. So you can't vary that as much. And then you feel like I did this and I did that and I did, and you're like, okay. And it just kind of overwhelms you eventually.
That's true. But you don't have to, you're capable of describing things around you, what other people are doing in first person. It's just that it lends itself to that. And it gets to the point where it puts your teeth on the edge of, can you just stop?
Yeah, so I
Give
think
me a real
people who
story.
have a lot of, because I'll read anything. I don't really care on the perspective one way or the other. I write more in third person because I know I don't necessarily have the skill to consistently do first person with the voice. And even in
It's
fan
a
fiction, I would
struggle.
say I've written millions of words of fan fiction. I've wasted my life. But out of that, I can think of maybe 3 or 4 million words of fan fiction, maybe 200,000 that's in first person. And I can't think of one I've written in first person in the last 10 years. So it's not my thing. But I do understand why if somebody got burned out on not great written first person or first person for maybe newer authors where it wasn't really hitting all it could do, how that eventually turned them off of first person as a whole, as like a risk. I can't understand
Yeah.
how that fatigue can't set in.
As a side note, if you do get into writing fan fiction, one, it's fun. And two, it gives you a lot of practice writing specific voice because if you're writing from a specific character, then you have the audio version from, unless it's a book that you're writing fan fiction for. If you're talking about, like, I don't know, Bucky from Avengers or these days Agatha and Rio, then you can watch the show and write it from Agatha's point of view and you can kind of hear the voice. And if you get to practice hearing that voice, you can create a better voice and then say, okay, well, I know how to do these cues when I'm doing it in fan fiction. Now, in my original fiction from third person limited, I can still affect a specific voice. So it does give you a lot of practice for that.
Yeah, I will say that I think one of the reasons I was able to do first person in disclaimer, Smallville fic, I mean, that's how we met anyway, is that I chose Clark's first person and he is kind of a facile character. So there isn't a ton going on there, and it's more like a lack of self-reflection and voice to begin with. So that is what it is.
Yeah, I
I
am
will
doing like I'm trying to write a YA dystopia right now, and it is a challenge, even with all the practice that I've had doing voice, because then I have to think about what her voice is and things that I would not necessarily do in third person that are a little more conversational.
Exactly. One other thing before we move on to a few other more finite points is
Yeah,
we did mention very briefly perspective, second POV. There's not tons to say on it because people don't use it a lot, but just for a little clarification on second point of view, what are some pros and cons of that? Uh,
I think the con is that it's gonna confuse the reader if you're not careful, and it's difficult to sustain long term something lengthy, like as you like the You book and subsequently series is one of the few things that you would think of as like a novel that creates it, but it's not something that you see often because it is difficult to sustain second person long term.
And I think it can feel
Um,
gimmicky. I know there have been some good short stories over the years that have done it for like maybe a few thousand words, but outside of the You, which again is the preface of the TV series, I can't think much of a book that was able to do it well.
Choose Your Own Adventure.
Yeah, well, that's different. Those were fun, and if they brought those back, I would read
Bring
them
them
all
back
over
for
again.
horror and sexy times would be fun.
Yeah, well, I think that's kind of part of it is with second person. The reason I think the You book works is because you're in the head of serial killer Joe Goldberg, and his You is literally talking to his victim, even though it's in like his own inner narration and thoughts. Like it's got this undertone of menace because he's not just writing, he's thinking about the You every time he thinks about the You, you're like, oh gosh, this guy in reality is like standing outside her window and watching her or going on social media to track her down. It's a You, but underlined with tension. I think that's why Choose Your Own Adventures were kind of fun as kids because they were taking you on an adventure and they gave that kind of emotionality of you're exploring things. I think if you can use that in a way that taps into an emotion really deeply, they could be fun. And yeah, I would totally bring back Choose Your Own Adventures for certain things like horror or romance even for adults. That could be fun because for a certain set of millennials and early Gen X's, we grew up on that in like middle school and lower high school, so we'd totally be down for that. But they're pretty rare.
The thing is, like, there's a difference between the You as in Joe Goldberg narrating someone else, or he's actually the perspective. Um, but if it's you and the perspective is that the person reading it is what you this is what you're doing, that's a different thing. And in either case, I think if we had to talk about a pro of this, is that it's very good for making the reader uneasy and projecting really difficult and complex emotions on them. I'm not saying it's
Yeah.
easy to do that, but that's
Well, even
a
with the choose your own
strength of it.
adventures, like you knew if you accidentally picked the wrong storyline, you die and you have to be like,
Yeah.
darn it, and go back and figure out where you made your mistake to win the book. There is that kind of
Whoops.
underlying tension there too, because if you don't do this right, you're gonna drown in the Amazon. So, as we go through our journey, you were talking a little bit earlier about present tense and how
Uh,
sometimes people couldn't think in that. And like, so what's the difference between like tenses when you're using them with point of view?
okay. We've talked about present tense because that's a very popular one, is to not just put it in first person, but first person present is very popular. And I think it's popular because it does give this sense of immediacy of things are happening right now. Everything's very intense. But again, at the same time, it's hard to align time well, which can kill your pacing. Another problem with the first person present is not being very good with your tenses. And that's the same with past. Whatever you're comfortable with is probably where you want to start, then go from there. Because I have seen people try to switch into present because it's popular, but not being good enough with the tenses, not to make it a huge mess, and a huge pain. Wherein I would have a paragraph where they started it in present, they went back to past perfect. I'll explain what that is in a minute, and then into regular past, and then they would just stay in past until they remember they were supposed to be doing this at present. And then you might get some conditional flipped around in there somewhere. So you have like this whole mess of when are we at this point? And that's insane. You definitely don't want that to get to the page when your reader has it in their actual book.
I would
Um,
say that happens to me a lot, and you'll explain the tenses and what they mean in a second. You're a little bit better at them in English than I am. But I have done books, and I did one recently, which is quite a long, we'll call it a superhero novel in first person. But again, that experience of tense inconsistency, and that's really hard. A lot of my line edits and that level of edits end up being people or authors who have chunks where not the whole book, but often there were chunks or scenes or parts where they forgot what tense they were in and trying to go back and check that and make sure it's actually in the tense that's the main tense for the book. So there's often a lot of tense errors I see again in
yeah.
newer writers, but sometimes in even more established writers. And tense errors are just really hard for readers to follow. They're not just incorrect, they make it very confusing, like you said, for when are we, for readers to follow. But I do a lot of tense correction in work. I definitely do.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that you can't just switch that main tense very easily. You can't have the whole thing in past and say, okay, can we switch this to present real quick? Not going to be real quick. It's going to be a pain. If you switch from first person to third person or third person to first person and decide, okay, well, I am just going to make my whole book in first person because that's what's selling, that's going to be an onerous task for you. It is going to be very difficult.
And don't try and be like, I want to combine first and third in a book because that's not usually how that works.
I mean, we can talk about this in a minute. Sometimes people can do it, but it's not something you do lightly. Um,
Yeah, no, I have a great example that mixes it, but like, yeah, it's not, it's a deliberate decision and you think you can pull it off and have the practice to do that.
yeah. Okay, so back to tenses. What did you want me to explain?
Oh, you're talking about how you read something that went from past perfect, sorry, from
Okay.
present to past perfect to past. And I think people
Okay,
don't
so let's
necessarily know what past
talk
perfect
about,
is.
yeah,
Yeah.
perfect tenses are a pain in the butt. If you know them, you know them, and if you don't know them, then that you're just gonna have to deal with it. So the reason that people sometimes will enjoy the present more is because they can just not do the past perfect, because the past perfect exists to be you're in the past, you were chugging along in the past, but then you want to describe something that happened before this past event, that's the past perfect. My common example usually is because I had forgotten to lock the door, the burglar entered my apartment easily. We have a timeline there. The door didn't get locked, and then the burglar entered. And so that comes up specifically as the past perfect is clunky, and people will try to eliminate it. But if you're in present tense and you suddenly bust out the past perfect without having been in the past, we're all confused. So if that sounds like gibberish, then you might want to try to brush up on them. But like the thing about the perfect tense is that it helps us have more specific moments in time. And that's one of the reasons you don't want to switch from one to the other without really knowing how to finesse those tenses to know what's happening when. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I would say that the reason I made it wasn't a joke, it was honest. She is an English teacher, an English professor actually. And so she's more aware of grammar in that language. I've spent a lot
Ugh.
of time as an interpreter and translator for Spanish, so I've done a lot of things in like the perfect and the pluperfect, but I've done it in Spanish, so my brain can translate it, but it doesn't
Yeah.
always remember what the terms and how it reads in English is the same way. But grammar is intense, it's very complicated. But I think if the last 5 minutes you're like, what is going on? The main takeaway is tenses are complicated, but you really can't have a book that jumps between past and present whenever it feels like it. And if you're
Yeah.
writing
You
in present tense, you're more tempted.
keep it as consistent as you want, or as you can manage to be, because you're going to go to an editor, and hopefully that editor is on the ball about this as we are. And their whole point is to make sure that those stay consistent, but you need to start by knowing at least the basic level and what tense you want to stay in. Um, I have gotten notes from people when I've been editing where we're doing the past tense as the main tense, but they want to limit the amount of past perfect use because it is a little clunky to say he had, he had, he had. So sometimes they will finesse around that and not entirely use the past perfect all the time, just for the fluidity of the text. But knowing what it is and when you need it to really make sense, that's an editor issue.
It's true. Just try not to jump tenses if you can because it saves time. I
Yeah.
mean, editors don't charge by the hour, but if it just helps your editor be able to focus on other deeper issues, even
Yeah,
if it's
no,
above
but
your
sometimes
skill.
if they'll see that there's a lot of editing to be done, if there's a lot of errors, they may not be giving you the cheaper price because it's going to take a lot longer.
Exactly. What about genre signaling? What does that mean to you?
And genre signaling, it's a whole host of things. Like it can be the cover, it can be certain things about the characters, it can be certain thematic elements. When it comes to point of view, it means that some genres have adopted specific points of view as what you tend to expect from that genre.
Yeah. And I think that is also why people sometimes choose points of view that don't always work for them and where they are as a writer, what they actually want to do with the purpose of the book, because they're working from this is always how this genre goes, so I need to do it this way. And I think about that a lot in romance because, yes, for a while, especially I would say in that post 2012 and contemporary romance and new adult romance where it was all, I'm going to use super honest with you, like a clone of 50 Shades of Grey with the billionaire and the blah, 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 and her perspective and his perspective. A lot of them wanted to mimic everything about that book, which is first person for both characters, for actually Anastasia, but they wanted
Yeah.
to mix it so you could have hero, heroine back and forth in first person. I would say now I have seen contemporaries where it's equally as likely you could see it in first person as in third, or at least a third to maybe 40% are going to be in third. So it's not as much of a, oh no, you wrote your romance in third person. But I think a lot of the times for me, it's like, yes, there are certain genres where it's more likely it's going to be first person, and that is going to be young adult, especially, but also anything new adult was gone for a while. Now it's kind of making a comeback. New adult is like 18. They should be in college age, even if they may be not actually in college, but 18 to like 22, and then adult
Yeah.
contemporary, which is anybody between 22 and 30. After that, you don't exist anymore. So those ones, and then urban fantasy. Again, I've seen more third person in urban fantasy, especially since the early 2010s. But because that comes from noir and is very much just detective fiction, but with paranormal beings in it, it kind of has an homage to the Sam Spade and the Maltese Falcon, Humphrey Bogart kind of things, is still associated often with first person.
Yeah. You'll also see first person in dystopia a lot. Like it can be either because it's technically on the border of sci-fi usually. Like you can have a fantasy dystopia, but it's less common. But there are a lot of main texts in dystopia that are first person because they do want you to have that sense of immediacy with the main character. Now, and utopia proper were a little different back in the day because you would have, I don't know, there's like this character who comes out of nowhere to tell you all the things about the utopia and explain it to you. But then it moves into a little more first person so that you can experience the dystopia with the character. That's somewhat important. But then they also sometimes have genre bending, genre breaking things like I've mentioned a couple of times, The Handmaid's Tale, and how at the
Yeah.
end of The Handmaid's Tale, this has been first person all the way through. It's been offered, but in the end, they tell us that this was a set of tapes that they transcribed after they got her out. And they talk about Gilead in past tense. So, like, they're doing something there. That's a shift between first and third because the ending of a dystopia is meant to suggest, okay, you can still fight. And then you have Parable of the Sower, which is entirely in Lauren Olamina's perspective. And then the second book in the series is narrated by her daughter, who is collecting transcripts not just from Olamina's journal, but from the father, from the uncle, like other snippets of things so that they can create that bigger world. Then because Octavia Butler is the grand dame of science fiction, she can do it. So like there are things within dystopia that signal that this could be our main way of signaling dystopia, but it's not necessary. Um,
I
I've
won't
had big,
overhash it, but I would say that the book version of Planet of the Apes, called Monkey Planet because French, does this, but they use it more as an effect to, at the end of the day, create a twist and sort of a bit of humor to the book, because the book's actually more of a satire than it is a dystopia. But yeah, I've seen it in other types of more stuff that borders on science fiction where they use that as, if not a rug pull, then at least a sort of a surprise at the end that hammers in their message. And back to you, I'm sorry. Um,
I think I was going to move into talking about like fantasy as being generally thought to be third person because of the abilities you get out of it. I did have like a throwdown with a client, not like we fought each other, but more that she fired me because I was trying to explain to her that there are a lot like signaling via third person in fantasy is what you want to do if you want it. This was before the romanticy craze. So there was no like, I can just to this book and this book and this book. She was determined it has to be, there's romance in it, so it has to be first person. I'm like, this is not going to work. And she said, you're fired. So um, at the end of the day, you don't have to listen to your editor. I don't know if
was
she ever
that
ended up writing
the
it.
Ayn Rand one? Or it wasn't Ayn Rand, but it felt like it, where the guy who just is like, here's my
No,
businessy business for like 50 pages in the middle of
no,
a show. That was a lot. It was like, I have a magical businessy business. I'm like, I don't need to know how you have a perspective fix or
those
like a
were
big
in first
business
person,
plan.
weren't they? It didn't seem
Yeah.
like it. It was so extensive.
No, you didn't read the 50 pages about the, here's my business plan to get all powerful in the city. And I'm like, I can't do this anymore. So these people are really married to the perspective because they're like, this is how it has to be because this is the only way I've read it, or this is the convention that's the most popular. But sometimes it's short sight. So you were saying fantasy, you get that advantage with the third person,
I guess if your editor's telling you one thing, like you don't have to listen to them. Like they can just tell you this is probably what your best bets are, but okay.
which is a fair point because if you get into a relationship with an editor, and we'll talk about this more, but you do make choices. Even as a client, you make choices, but people are trying to tell you the best they know from a lot of years of experience at the same time.
But now romantasy does exist, so you could do your fantasy novel in whatever you want.
Yeah. And also, as far as third goes, sci-fi works with that a lot. Horror. Sometimes there's first person horror, and I think especially not necessarily published, but podcasts that have scripts or creepypastas do first person. But I think in general, horror tends to work better if it's third person because you can get that greater sense of the scope of the horror. And especially if you're having a character who's going to die mid-book because they're like the first cannon fodder, that way people don't feel cheated. Like all of a sudden you've got a new narrator. So that's thought as well.
What would you say to someone who wanted to kill their character in the middle of the book? Let's say we're not dealing necessarily with Divergent, but like if you're doing something and they want to off the
I
character.
think the only two times I can think about where it happened are in Divergent, where in the final book Tris does die, and they just make the other guy who is her love interest the narrator, and also in Twilight Breaking Dawn because Bella is in a coma kind of thing after she's bitten but hasn't risen yet, and she's had red asthma and it's a big trauma. But Jacob narrates for about a third, not
That's a
out of
little weird.
nowhere. Yeah, he's never been the main focal character between her and Edward, and he's never had first person. Only Bella has had first person in the first three and a half novels. So
It's like,
readers didn't take that well either, even though she survives and ends up finishing the narration herself. But I think once readers get through two or three books where that's the heroine, that's the hero, that's whoever, narrating as the first person, they're not as great of, oh, well, now she's in a coma, so, or oh, crud, now she died, so here's the other person. They don't seem to like,
I think it makes it more difficult for you to continue a series if it's been fully from one person's perspective.
yeah,
Um, I can't help but think of the problem of Harry Potter, where because it is third person limited exclusively, and Harry is not a particularly observant character, that were moments where Rowling would just have a chapter from someone else's perspective without any notice. It's just like suddenly there's a third person omniscient scene with Snape doing some kind of magical handshake. And that's there because she needs to signal to something to the audience, but she can't do it in her framework. And I guess that's frustration for me of when people break their own rules. Because I focus so much on world building, I want people to stick to their rules or at least try to work around them. But
but Midnight, can't I just shift between any POV I want?
I mean, you can, but the reader's not necessarily going to follow you. That makes me think of
So,
that book I was reading where it was both, what was it? I think it was second person past and then first person present
oh,
alternating.
that's confusing.
And it was so disorienting. Also, the second person past was someone writing a letter to someone else telling them about their history together. And I'm like, this person was there. Why is this in second person? Why are you telling this person what happened that you were both there for? And they don't have Alzheimer's, so no excuse.
Yeah.
Wild. So that you can do whatever you want at the end of the day, but it's not necessarily gonna work.
Yeah, I will
Um,
say that I had one recently where it was all like everything but second person perspective. I had a little bit about first person omniscient. I had a little bit of first person. I had mostly first person, like limited, just like the one heroine. But sometimes she'd have notes where it's like the heroine was reflecting on, well, I'll have to tell you about that another day. And I'm like, but then it'd be third person from some of her love interests. But then sometimes it'd be third person omniscient, where it was more like once upon a time God outside narrator on at least one chapter,
Make a
and it was
struggle.
all is through all the book, and it was just very confusing. You're just like, yeah, pick a struggle, because it wasn't for effect. She just didn't know. She didn't know the difference between slipping into more omniscient and the different points of view to begin with. But she definitely didn't get that you just can't go. Here's the first person because I really like my heroine, but I want to hear from her love interest. So here's some third persons from them just sporadically. Sometimes this guy will get a chapter, that guy will get a. It's too much. It's too much.
Yeah, you got to be careful with those shifts. Like, I want to mention right before we talk a little bit more about the shifts is you can actually do first person omniscient. Like, it's in first person, and that person thinks they know everything. And the book that have the example is the Lemony Snicket books because he was not there for any of that stuff. He was not present for any of the things he's talking about. He just collected all this information and then he wrote about it like he thought he knew exactly what happened, which is funny because then they get into the Beatrice letters and she tells him he got some stuff wrong. So he's very confident that he knows enough to completely slam this 12-year-old girl of Carmelita Spats of like how terrible a person she is, but he's never met her. So you can play around with things like that and you can split the shifts in POV, but you don't do it without considering what your audience is going to do and one, what they're expecting and how much they're going to be able to follow you. So like
Yeah, and
in
I
romance, you have usually the lead couple, either just the woman or the lead couple, as you mentioned with the 50 Shades goes back and forth between the two of them,
it
but romance
doesn't, but
tends to.
eventually she writes like the second trilogy from his perspective because cash grab. So I
Well,
think in my mind it
he's a
blurs
psycho,
together.
so
Yeah, yeah,
um
no, it's real bad. It's like reading because I have actually read American Psycho because I like that book from Bret Easton Ellis. Go figure. And the narration is really similar, and you're like, oh no. I don't think she did that on purpose. I just think Christian. Gray is that much of a creepy cipher of like craziness, and you're like, oh no. Sorry, derailed, but
No, but then you have like the why choose romance where it's mostly the heroine, and then you'll toss in one of the dudes occasionally, where it doesn't have to be like her, him, and then him, and then him, and then him, and then back to her. Like it's mostly her, and then it'll be like Brett, and then her, and then Suave,
Bob.
and then
Yeah,
whatever,
whatever. Yeah, I have a
where they
lot of
can focus
feelings
on her because
about
that's the
why
genre.
choose. Yeah, because I feel like if there's some really good ones that I have read. I have this weird, like, I'm the kind of person who likes horror movies and I like found footage, and I know they're not going to end up very great most of the time. Same thing about reading. I like why choose, especially if they're going to be actually poly and have FF and MM couplings in them. But like, I know they're not always going to be very good because what happens is a lot of people feel they have to set up a why choose with the heroine, usually is the archetype, and three or four love interests, and they have to do it all in like 50 to 60,000 words, and then it just becomes love interest one has blonde hair, love interest love two has black
The
hair, and
different
love
colored
interest
Ken
three
dolls.
has like, yeah, exactly, they're interchangeable personalities, and like you don't feel like you get a sense of any of those guys at all. It's a worse problem in paranormal romance because you'll just say, oh, a prophecy says we all must be together, so there's no tension or like struggle for the, usually the male love interest, to agree with each other or not fight each other. But I've seen it done well where they actually commit to do it over a course of a trilogy, and they have to actually have three of those characters and the heroine, and they build that relationship over time, and you get to know each of the, usually the
Yeah.
guy love interest, and what their perspectives are. I just think with why choose, which is a whole other topic, but a lot of times they become so indistinguishable because it's such a short time frame that it's like, eh. But I think that also goes back to point of view. Like it's mostly when it's the head why chooses this female fulfillment fantasy where everything's doting on you, you're the center of attention, you're in the footsteps of the heroine. And so her perspective becomes so important that if you get a side chapter from love interest one or two or three sporadically, that's how it's going to go, but you're the focus because you're sort of living this experience through the heroine's first person perspective.
Yes. I think that in those few chapters with the guys, that they should try to make sure that character is unique, as if we can really get into their perspective. Because I have seen them switch over the guys chapter just to move the plot along, and you can do that, but it doesn't help with the character problem. Do you want us to be invested in this story a little bit, a little, whatever's happening?
So
We
how
need
do
to be
I
invested in him too.
make sure someone's not confused if I am, say I have a wide choose and I'm switching between narrators or in a first person or a third person limited, or even if it's, a romance, I've got two people going back and forth, especially in a first person. How do I denote that for people so they're not jarred by shifts?
Different fonts and colors.
No, no, we do not do that. I had seen this post at a Reddit group or something where the author's like, I have four first person point of views for my romance book, and I'm gonna do each character with a different color for their font and a different font, then have like their name at the top. And I was like, oh no, that's a lot of color, which doesn't even make
Yeah,
sense.
but
It's a
the
print on demand, you can't choose colors, but also I don't want to read a
yeah,
book where someone's Comic Sans and someone's Papyrus and then someone's whatever, and I'm like, it's too
wingdings,
much.
the wingdings guy.
At
Um,
that level, yeah.
I think that most people will just put the name at the top of the chapter and they're not going to have them bouncing around between different perspectives in the same chapter. That's the point of having the limit is that you choose this perspective for this point because this person is going to get us where we need to go at that point. If you rein yourself in enough to have, okay, this chapter is by Bob and this chapter is by Larry, and then the next chapter is going to be back to the heroine, Jessica, and then we back to the vampire love interest. And then if you delineate well enough, then it shouldn't be a problem to get too confused. We're going to be reading kind of quickly if we read a lot, and some readers are not even that attentive. So make sure that you are not switching it up so often that they don't know who's talking.
Yeah, I think
Um,
the each chapter per whoever's going to be the narrator and labeling the top of the chapter with the name helps a lot. And I agree also that I don't really, caveat, but and I'll explain in a second. I don't really like that I'll also switch within scenes. I don't think that's very helpful. I think it's really
yeah.
jarring most of the time.
It's hard. Back when I did fan fiction, I'd switch like each chapter would be back and forth between the characters, right? Each chapter would be like Lex and then Clark and then Lex and then Clark and Lex and then Clark. fine, everyone's going to follow that because they know who those characters are. But we don't know your original characters well enough to know the vocabulary of the thing. And you can signal at the top of the scene who's in charge of that scene through the perspective and what they're noticing, even in third person. But
Yeah.
it's actually harder in first person to signal at the top of the chapter who's doing what. But when I move into original fiction, I don't do it within the same chapter because it is so difficult to back and forth with them following me. That's the point,
Yeah.
is that I need them to follow along.
This is
So,
where, yeah, like my one thing is I understand if people who write romance want to do it within certain types of chapters where the scenes are intimate, but otherwise people get so confused.
look, just give enough sexy times that he gets a scene and she gets a scene, and
Yeah, I
it's
feel like it's still better if you strap different chapters for different sexy times.
MM. Then maybe we don't need to know what his thoughts are, honestly. And some of the why I choose, I really wish I hadn't been in their heads when they were with the girl because they're
I think,
thinking gross stuff. Can you just have
uh,
sex? That's a different point.
boy, now that's we found out
Different
another
chapter.
topic to talk about. It's just like how to get into a guy's head without making him super gross,
Ugh,
or a caricature of being a guy. That I see read it a lot, and maybe it's because I don't know. I just
be the not safe
sometimes
for work podcast.
yeah, well, yeah, but I mean more from I read the perspective of guys in romance fiction, and a lot of them are just jerks. A lot of them are just they're ready to have their own fresh and fit Andrew Tate style podcast. I'm like, oh,
That's
that's more about
exactly
how
it.
they
Like
view
that's the
women.
guy.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I would rather not. He can
Yeah.
go away. That's fine.
So I guess sometimes you can learn too much if you choose too many points of view, honestly. Like which was I said when you read Twilight, Edward's bad enough, but when you read Midnight Sun, you're like, oh my gosh, he's just a psychopath. I mean, vampires kill people, so that's kind of a given, but you're like, oh no. Sometimes knowing too much about a character, if you're too in their head, can backfire. So that's always something to be aware of. And then I think also when you're trying to decide who gets a chapter, at least for me, I think about who not just is going to be who's followed so we can get to the next plot point, but also who has the most at stake, who's dealing with the most things in that moment, who can, as you like to say a lot, who can have the most rocks thrown at them at that time.
Yeah, we want to know from the person who's most impacted. Do you have characters who are just watching stuff happen? And that's inevitable sometimes, especially if you're in the early parts, they're not fully interacting with things, but you don't want it to be wall to wall, this character watching other people, because that's not that interesting. They're just bumbling into things and they're not moving things forward or doing anything actively themselves. Then it gets boring. And why are we following this person?
Yeah, and I
I think
think
that
that's a
happens in some of the
big
ones that
point.
you've looked at. I don't know if you want to speak to it, where they have the heroine and then the heroine is not involved in any of the action. They just stay home while the guys go out and do something.
Yeah, no, I definitely have read that a couple of times. This won't even like shame the author because I've edited a lot of why choose and a lot of why choose of this sort of beginning romantasy phase about 2 years ago. But I did read a why choose with dragon shifters in it. And oftentimes they, even though the heroine was supposed to be part of their group and part of helping them do their mission, and had magical powers in her own right, because of course they always do, they would try and shelter her or say, we're going to do this thing and we'll come back. And so I'd be reading the heroine staying at the inn waiting for the guys to come back. And then they come back and tell her about what they had done. You're like, I wish I had seen that on the page. That would have been fun to read about a raid or whatever was
I
going
mean, that's
on.
at that point, you need to have one of those guys as your POV character
They
so that you can do that, or
were.
you can let her come along. It's
Yeah, that was the thing
romantasy, right?
is,
Like
yeah, no,
the heroine is going to do stuff whether
in
you
that
like it or
RH, they did alternate enough so you got the guys' perspectives, all three of them. They just chose to have it from her perspective during the raid, and I'm like, can I see the raid? I want to go with the guys on this. I want to see some action or have her come with them. But I've definitely had that experience where, especially if it's like a romance where it's like a hero and the heroine, and even if the heroine is supposed to have her own destiny or do her own thing, then they somehow try and over shelter and baby her. So she sits around waiting for the dude and she damsels a lot, which is frustrating. Because again, it's supposed to be in a genre like urban fantasy or paranormal romance or romantasy,
yeah.
where she's supposed to be as active and they just don't let her be. And these are by usually female authors, by the way. And you're just like, I definitely read one about a female werewolf. I think it was actually related to the one where it starts out where she completely f's up her audition to Juilliard by breaking a piano. And her parents are super unworried about the fact that she broke a Steinway, but that's another problem. But there's a lot of things where her love interest is just a one love interest in that particular case. You got to delineate, but he was doing some things where he was spying on a rival pack, and you just had scenes at her at home bonding at that time with other pack women. In that case, it was a first person limited to only her perspective. But a lot of times I feel like just frustrated when I know action is going on in that very time frame, but we're sitting with a person who's been benched.
No, I think we need to remember that this is our fantasy. This is our escapism of I want to be a part of the story. I want to be there. That's what I'm here to learn about is what happens in this story. So if you're staying home while they're having tea and cookies, that should be not an expansive epic fantasy. If it's a contemporary and the tea and cookies is a part of the plot or somehow, then sure. But if it's the fantasy or the urban fantasy or the romantasy, I want to be along for the ride.
I think that's really frustrating to me. And that kind of brings me to my last point that I can think of today is passive characters. Because sometimes if you limit your point of view or what you're willing to do with setting up your points of view, or even how much each character is going to get focal attention and rotating points of view, you create these characters who are passive. Especially, I see it most often with heroines where they're supposed to be doing something, but either because it's first person perspective and she's not supposed to know that yet, she can't, or she'll just stumble upon the information without earning it, or worse, where, like I said, that other book where it's three dragons and her, and they were all getting perspective chapters, but the manly men go off and do the thing. And so you're not getting her perspective for events that could be interesting because she's not allowed to go, but you're still not going along with the three dragon guys who are going to actually have a fight. You just get into that situation where she seems passive, but worse, they're going to come back, hang out, and then debrief her on what happened. So you kind of get told this like almost third hand, and it makes it really boring.
Yeah. Also, I think for those surprises, it means that you don't have the setup to them because she's not been there for that, or that she should have known that by now.
Yeah.
And if she's really as feisty as your dialogue has led us to believe, then she probably would have snuck out of
Yeah, no, sometimes
like
it is like that. I'm like, but what?
I thought she was energetic and takes no BS, but she's
Yeah,
gonna
I
stay
think
home and whatever.
feisty
No,
only
she's gonna sneak
applies to
out.
like banter. As long as she's bantering, she's feisty. If she actually has to go be involved in the manly men crusade stuff, then she can be very compliant. It was
If
just
you want to
uneven.
write a mouse, okay? Like you gotta pick a character. Give us who she is and stick with give her some character development. Maybe she gets stronger over time. But if she's gonna be who she is and she's not a passive person, then don't make her passive in the book. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, even though we're queer writers and queer people, and we do read FF as well, we read sapphic and we read male, I see this problem the most in heterosexual male female or female with several men in a why choose situation. I think part of that is limited point of view. I think part of that's a deeper discussion about internalized misogyny, about the heroine can only be strong in certain ways. She can be feisty with Banner, but she can't actually get in on the action as much as the big, strong alpha males. A rant for another time, but I definitely
Yeah.
see that the most with like I'm not. It's not that we forgot that other types of pairings or characters existed. It's just that it's something I see most recurrent in books where you're supposed to be following quote a strong heroine or an active heroine and like a paranormal romance or a romantasy or an urban fantasy, but she still isn't in on the action when she needs to be because men.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot. I have seen some people who will make that lead female character very strong. I can't remember the name of the author that I used to work for. She made someone a dragon queen of like they do have a lot of power and then they get involved in things, so they're not gonna be sitting home. It's not that this is something the genre has to do. It's a choice being made of showing either the female needs to stay at home or maybe the fantasy is that these people will take care of.
Which does intersect some with the why choose, which is more of a fantasy of I've got this hassle of usually men who are taking care of me and doting on me. And that I understand as part of the facet of it. I just find sometimes when I see a passive character, it's more often if it's going to be a split point of view between two leads, the woman in a het romance who becomes sort of sidelined or more passive. And
Yeah,
I don't know
it's
if
just
people are
really
aware of it
irritating when
or
you know that they have all this power, but then the guys don't let them to do anything, or they tell
yeah,
them not to do things and then they don't do it. Because that the tension stops existing of like what would that character who has all that power do when someone tells them no, you can't go, because we would have male feelings about it if you went, and then that's annoying. Do we have anything else to say about point of view? Not that it's not interesting, it's
no,
just it probably should be a
well, I
different
just think that's
podcast.
my wrap up is that with point of view, be aware of why you're choosing it, be deliberate about your choice of it, stick to it if you can, don't alternate between different versions of it. And I think the biggest thing for me is just because it's a convention in the genre you want to write, it doesn't mean that you have to go ahead and do it. That there's always exceptions to the rule that a lot of genres that were predominantly first person even 10 or 15 years ago have more examples of third person, but really just make sure you choose what works for the purpose of your story
Yeah,
and for your characters, and don't just choose something because it's popular. And I think that's what I see the
yeah,
most is people choose it because it's popular, and then it's limiting what they can do and making their characters come off as either passive or sometimes just not aware of
yeah.
information, a little too stupid to live.
You want to choose what's going to service your story as well as showcase your strengths as a writer.
I think a way to do that when you're at home, so to speak, is if you're a writer, you're probably already a fan of reading in these genres. I would say if you're planning on, you're like, okay, I really like X, Y, and Z romances. Fourth Ring works for me. Court of Thorn and Roses, whatever. And you sit down and you think about it. You're like, okay, but this part of this book did work for me. Why? Or okay, I did read a third person romance, and actually this worked for me because. Don't just read the books and not think about them. If you're going to really start writing in that genre, read a few of those, reread a few of your favorites deliberately, and think about what they did with their point of view for that book that worked for you and what didn't, and which point of view you want to choose within that genre based on what your favorites could have done better. Do that
Yeah.
research to make those deliberate decisions.
Yeah, that does make sense. Of like as a writer, you want to also be a reader of what's this is, and most people who started writing from a young age are practicing things that they observed. When I was in middle school, I was reading R.L. Stein and Christopher Pike books, but I was really into that one vampire series. I was practicing the voice from that character before I even had fanfic to deal with. You're using the things that you read to pick up tricks and skills and observe.
If you think there's someone who you read who's like, this point of view really made sense, or you love Six of Crows a lot, and you're like, this is how they were able to integrate six
Yeah.
different characters. And if you see someone who does something, you're like, this blows my mind. I want to understand how to start learning to do that. Then read more of the work that's like that, read more the way they construct things, reverse engineer something. If you find something that really works for you as a reader and you're like, this blew my mind, I want to learn how to do it as a writer, study that, and at least it helps you know and understand why it worked for you and how you might be able to repeat it in your own original work. I guess my biggest takeaway is don't feel locked in to a point of view just because that it's a choice you have to make and you have to be really decisive about it and think about it. Thank you for joining the Otherlands Editing Podcast. Look for our next episode coming soon, and in the interim, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also, if you want more information or want to connect, you can find Margaret Bates and Midnight Voss at our site, Otherlands Editing. Until next time, keep writing and keep refining your words.